Sometimes the moment you realize you're no longer welcome in your own family is the moment everything finally becomes clear. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and last Mother's Day, I learned exactly where I stood in my son's house. The invitation had arrived a week earlier, sent by Daniel in a short text message that simply said, "Mom, we're hosting Mother's Day dinner at our place this year. Hope you can make it." It wasn't the kind of warm invitation I used to receive when Daniel was younger, but I told myself people get busy, life moves fast, and maybe Ashley was just overwhelmed planning the dinner. So on Sunday afternoon, I did what I had done for decades as a mother. I showed up with something made from the heart. I baked an apple cinnamon cake in the same glass pan I'd used for years, wrapped it carefully in a clean kitchen towel, and drove the 12 miles to their suburban home just outside Chicago. The sky was bright, the kind of mild spring day where the air smells fresh and the trees are finally green again after a long winter. I remember thinking how nice it would be to sit around the table, share a meal, maybe laugh about old family stories. When I pulled into the driveway, there were already several cars parked along the curb. Ashley's sister was there, a couple of neighbors, and Daniel's coworker who lived down the street. The house looked lively through the front windows, sunlight reflecting off glasses and plates set across the dining room table. I picked up the cake, smoothed my coat, and walked to the door. Ashley opened it with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, Margaret," she said, as if she had almost forgotten I might come. I handed her the cake and told her I hoped everyone liked apple cinnamon. She thanked me in a quick, distracted way before turning back toward the dining room where everyone was gathering. I stepped inside slowly, taking in the decorations, pink flowers in small jars, folded napkins, a banner that said Happy Mother's Day across the wall. The dining table was beautifully arranged with plates and chairs, but something caught my attention almost immediately. Every seat around that table had a place card with someone's name on it. Ashley's mother, Linda. Her sister, Rachel. Two neighbors. Daniel at the head of the table. Even the coworker had a card. I stood there quietly holding my purse while Ashley carried the cake toward the kitchen. Then I looked again at the table, counting each chair one more time. 8 chairs. 8 names. And not a single one of them said Margaret. For a moment, I wondered if perhaps I had misunderstood something. So I stood there quietly and looked around the room again, telling myself that maybe another chair would be brought in later, or maybe one of the place cards had simply been forgotten. But the longer I stared at that table, the more obvious it became that every detail had been carefully arranged and that nothing there was accidental. People were beginning to gather around the dining room now, carrying glasses of iced tea and small plates of appetizers, chatting easily the way people do when they feel comfortable in someone else's home. Ashley's mother, Linda, was already sitting in one of the chairs, complimenting the flower arrangements while Rachel laughed beside her. Daniel was near the window pouring drinks, smiling and greeting everyone, looking relaxed in a way that told me he believed the evening was going exactly as planned. I slowly set my purse down on a small side table and walked toward the kitchen doorway where Ashley was cutting slices of lemon for the drinks. I tried to keep my voice calm and light as I asked, "Ashley, where would you like me to sit?" She paused for a moment with the knife in her hand, not looking surprised by the question at all, just slightly inconvenienced as if I had asked something unnecessary. Then she placed the knife down, wiped her hands with a paper towel, and turned toward me with a small smile that felt colder than the spring air outside. "Actually, Margaret," she said in a tone that was pleasant enough for the room, but firm enough that I knew she meant every word. "This dinner is really meant for the mothers who are part of this household." At first I thought perhaps I had misunderstood her, but before I could respond she continued speaking, loud enough now that a few nearby conversations started to fade. She explained that the evening had been planned to celebrate the women who had been helping raise the children in the home and supporting the family day to day, and that space at the table was limited. Someone behind me shifted uncomfortably, and I noticed Daniel glance over from the other side of the room with a confused expression, but he did not say anything. Ashley kept her smile, as if she were explaining a simple seating arrangement at a restaurant rather than telling someone they did not belong at their own family gathering. She suggested that if I wanted to stay I could sit in the living room and have some dessert later after dinner was finished. The words themselves were polite, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. I could feel several pairs of eyes watching me now, waiting to see how I would react. And in that quiet moment, something inside me settled into a calm I had not expected. I realized that Ashley had not forgotten to include my name at the table. She had simply decided that it did not belong there. The drive home was quiet, and I did not turn on the radio the way I usually did during the 12-mile trip back to my house. The late afternoon sun stretched across the road, casting long shadows from the trees that lined the neighborhood streets, and I found myself thinking about how strange it was that one short conversation could change the way a person saw their family. I had spent most of my life believing that patience and kindness could smooth over almost any problem, especially within a family. But as I drove through the familiar streets of the Chicago suburbs, something inside me shifted. It was not anger, and it was not sadness either. It was clarity. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the small brick house I had lived in for more than 30 years looked exactly the same as it always had. The front porch swing moved gently in the breeze, and the maple tree in the yard was just beginning to fill with new leaves. I carried my purse inside and set it on the kitchen counter, then poured myself a glass of water and sat down at the table. The house was quiet in a peaceful way that felt very different from the tense silence I had left behind at Daniel's place. For a while I simply sat there thinking about the past few years. Daniel had moved into that house after his wedding, and I had been the one who helped make it possible. When the real estate market had been difficult and they could not qualify for a large enough loan, I had stepped in quietly and purchased the property myself. The arrangement had seemed simple at the time. Daniel and Ashley would live there, take care of the place, and treat it as their home while I handled the legal ownership and the property taxes. I had trusted them because they were family. Over the years I had also helped with other things. The sport utility vehicle in their garage had been purchased with money from my savings after Daniel mentioned they needed something reliable for work and errands. I never asked for recognition or repayment because that is what many mothers do. They support their children when they can. But sitting there at my kitchen table that evening, I began to see those decisions through a different lens. Ashley had looked directly at me in front of a room full of people and calmly explained that I was not part of the household she wanted to celebrate. The message had been very clear. I was welcome to bring desserts and smiles, but not a seat at the table. I finished my glass of water and stood up slowly, walking toward the small desk in the corner of the living room where I kept my paperwork neatly organized in labeled folders. There were documents there that most people in that dining room had never seen and probably never even thought about. I opened the drawer and took out a folder with the address of Daniel's house printed across the top. As I placed it on the desk, I felt the same calm feeling settle in again. The quiet understanding that sometimes the most important decisions are not made during loud arguments, but during peaceful moments when everything finally becomes clear. I sat down at my desk and opened the folder slowly, not because I was unsure about what I was doing, but because I wanted to think clearly about every step. Inside the folder were several documents I had not looked at in months, maybe even years, but I remembered exactly what each one represented. The first paper was the original purchase agreement for the house, where Daniel and Ashley were now living. I still remembered the day I signed it. The market had been competitive at the time, and Daniel had called me sounding discouraged because the bank would not approve the loan amount they needed. Without saying much about it to anyone else, I stepped in and bought the property under my own name so they could move in and start their life together. My intention had never been to control anything. I simply wanted my son to have stability and a comfortable home where his family could grow. The arrangement had been simple and based entirely on trust. They would live there, take care of the house, and handle the utilities and everyday expenses while I maintained the legal ownership and paid the property taxes each year. At the time, it felt like the kind of quiet support a parent gives without expecting recognition. I turned the page and looked at another document that listed the vehicle identification number for the sport utility vehicle parked in their garage. Daniel had mentioned needing a reliable car after his old sedan began having mechanical problems, and once again I had helped without making a big announcement about it. The title had been registered under my name because it was easier for insurance and financing, but I had never treated it as anything other than their car. As I reviewed the paperwork that evening, I began to see the full picture more clearly than I ever had before. Ashley had spoken with such confidence at the dinner table, explaining who belonged in her household and who did not. She had said those words as if the house itself were entirely hers, as if the walls and roof and front door were simply part of her life that she controlled. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands together, remembering the look on her face when she told me the dinner was meant for the mothers who were part of that home. The thought stayed with me for a moment, not in a bitter way, but in a thoughtful one. If she truly believed that house defined her family, then perhaps it was time for everyone to remember exactly how that house had become part of their lives in the first place. I closed the folder and placed it neatly back on the desk, then reached for my phone and set it beside the papers. There are moments in life when people expect loud confrontations or dramatic arguments, but I have always believed that calm decisions often carry the greatest weight. I glanced at the clock on the wall, noticing that it was just after 8 in the evening, and I made a quiet decision that tomorrow morning I would begin taking the necessary steps to organize everything properly, because sometimes the most respectful response to disrespect is simply to remind people of the truth they have chosen to forget. After Mr. Reed explained the legal situation, the room became quiet for a moment as I considered what he had said. I appreciated the way he spoke calmly, without pressure or judgment, simply presenting the facts in a clear and respectful way. I told him that my intention was never to cause unnecessary hardship for anyone. Daniel was still my son, and nothing could change that. At the same time, I believe that respect within a family should move in both directions, not only from parent to child, but also from child to parent. Mr. Reed nodded thoughtfully and explained that there were several reasonable options available. One option was to formally establish a rental agreement that clearly defined the arrangement, including responsibilities and expectations. Another option was to give formal notice that the property would need to be vacated within a certain amount of time, which is a standard legal procedure when ownership and residency are different. He emphasized that any decision should be handled professionally and with proper documentation so that there would be no confusion later. I listened carefully and asked a few practical questions about timelines and procedures. When he finished explaining everything, I folded my hands together on the desk and thought about the dinner table again, about the quiet moment when Ashley had calmly explained that I did not belong among the mothers of that household. The memory did not make me angry anymore. Instead, it reminded me that people sometimes reveal their true beliefs through small actions rather than loud arguments. I finally told Mr. Reed that I wanted to move forward with a formal notice regarding the property. I explained that Daniel and Ashley should have time to make their own arrangements and take responsibility for their household the way independent adults do. Mr. Reed nodded again and began outlining the steps that would be taken over the next few days. He would prepare the official documents, and once they were delivered, Daniel and Ashley would have a clear period of time to decide what they wanted to do next. Everything would follow the standard legal process used in situations like this. There would be no surprises or confusion, only clear communication. When the meeting ended, I thanked him for his time and placed the signed paperwork back into the envelope he provided. Walking out of the office building that afternoon, I felt an unusual sense of calm. The sky above the city was bright, and the streets carried the normal rhythm of people going about their day, unaware of the small turning points that quietly reshape someone's life. I drove home slowly, thinking not about conflict but about balance. Families grow stronger when people value one another, but when respect disappears, sometimes the only responsible choice is to step back and allow everyone to learn where the true foundations of a home really come from. 3 days passed quietly after my meeting with Mr. Reed, and during that time I returned to my normal routine as if nothing unusual had happened. I watered the plants on my porch each morning, walked to the corner bakery for fresh bread once during the week, and spent a peaceful afternoon organizing old photo albums in my living room. Life has a gentle rhythm when you allow it to move without constant worry, and I had reached an age where calm days were something I valued deeply. On Thursday afternoon, however, the quiet routine shifted slightly when my phone rang while I was folding laundry in the bedroom. I recognized Daniel's number immediately on the screen. For a moment, I simply looked at it, knowing that eventually this conversation would come. I answered the call with a steady voice and greeted him the same way I always had. Daniel sounded unsettled, and there was a tension in his tone that I had rarely heard before. He explained that earlier that morning a certified letter had arrived at the house, delivered by a postal worker who required a signature. Inside the envelope were official documents from Mr. Reed's office explaining the legal status of the property and the formal notice regarding future occupancy. Daniel said that he had read the papers twice because at first he could not believe what they meant. I listened quietly while he spoke, allowing him to finish without interrupting. After a moment, he asked me directly whether the information in the letter was accurate. I told him calmly that it was. There was a long pause on the line as he absorbed the reality of the situation. He admitted that he had never realized the house was still legally under my name, and that he had assumed over the years that the arrangement had changed somehow without him paying attention to the details. I explained that the arrangement had never changed because there had never been a reason to change it. I had trusted them to treat the home with respect and appreciation. Daniel sounded troubled as he described how Ashley had reacted after reading the documents. According to him, she was shocked and confused, insisting that there must have been some mistake. She had believed that the house belonged entirely to them, just as she had confidently explained during the dinner a few days earlier. I did not mention the dinner directly, but the memory of that moment stayed quietly in my mind as Daniel continued speaking. Eventually his voice softened, and he asked why I had made the decision to take this step now. I took a slow breath before answering because I wanted my words to be clear but not cruel. I told him that a home is more than walls and furniture. It is also built on respect, and when someone makes it clear that you do not belong under that roof, the most reasonable response is sometimes to allow them the independence they claim to want. The line remained silent again for several seconds as Daniel considered what I had said, and in that silence I sensed that the meaning of the situation was finally beginning to settle in.